To begin, the community of aristocratic canonesses of St. Servatius at Quedlinburg was founded in 936 by the Ottonian Emperor Otto I the Great at the behest of his mother, the Dowager Queen Matilda. The convent converted to Protestantism in 1539 to 40. It was eventually suppressed in 1810, its buildings and furnishings becoming property of the Prussian state in 1815. Over the course of these 9 decades, the conventual buildings naturally underwent campaigns of significant restoration and replacement, so that little of what we see today is original. The Church of St. Servatius in its contemporary state, for example, largely reflects multiple late 19th and mid 20th century interventions that sought to replicate the appearance of the basilica in its early 12th century Romanesque phase. A mid-10th century church survives, however, serving since the later 10th century as the crypt of the conventual basilica. In the east end are preserved the grave sites of the German king Henry I the Fowler, progenitor of the Ottonian dynasty that ruled the Roman Empire throughout the 10th and early 11th centuries. His queen Matilda, at whose instigation the convent was founded by their son Otto, and their granddaughter, also named Matilda, first abbess of St. Servatius. Additionally, a visitor to the crypt can admire a number of female effigies arranged along the walls. These memorialize several medieval abbesses who ruled St. Servatius between 999 and 1511. Executed in the late 12th, 13th, 15th, and 16th centuries, they comprise an unusually extensive sequence of abbatial images that are consistent in key aspects of their composition and iconography. While modernisms are introduced across the series, especially in garb, the effigies cohere as a group intended to communicate medieval conventual identity specific to Quedlinburg through the representation of the abbesses' bodies. All of these monuments were originally located in the upper church, site of the principal liturgical activity, and in this way formed part of the devotional and commemorative culture constituted by the architecture of the church, its decoration and furnishings, treasury objects in liturgical use, the clergy and the congregation of religious and secular worshipers. As we will see, however, precisely how they functioned in the medieval liturgical context is difficult to ascertain. Today, I consider the significance of these monuments both within their shared conventual framework and their disparate historical circumstances, concluding with a discussion of their fate in the aftermath of the Reformation, when most of them disappeared from view and eventually memory, and in the 19th and early 20th century, when they were rediscovered in the nave of St. Servatius and subsequently reaccommodated in the crypt. The canonical community at Quedlinburg flourished during the 10th century. Because of its foundational proximity to imperial authority, St. Servatius was subject to the oversight only of the emperor and the pope, not to the local episcopate. The convent grew wealthy, not solely because of immensely valuable donations from royal relatives, but also because the community was permitted to establish a market at Quedlinburg in 994, laying the groundwork for the growth of a town governed by the abbess. With extensive executive and judicial authority, the abbess of St. Servatius was a powerful figure on the political landscape of early medieval Germany. While the Salian rulers who succeeded the Ottonians in 1024 were somewhat less concerned with the convent at Quedlinburg, the two abbesses who ruled throughout most of the second half of the 11th century, were imperial princesses. Beatrix I and her half-sister Adelheid II were daughters of Emperor Henry III and sisters of Henry IV. Adelheid was succeeded by a woman named Eilicha, who was probably merely a member of the Saxon aristocracy and a placeholder in the abbatiate, intended to serve only until a more appropriate, imperially connected candidate emerged. And indeed, Eilicha's successor, Agnes I, was Henry V's cousin. Because of these family ties, St. Servatius' wealth and prestige remained high into the 12th century. After Agnes' death in 1125 or 1126, however, circumstances changed when she was succeeded by a Saxon noblewoman, Gerborg of Cappenberg. All medieval abbesses of Quedlinburg thereafter would be members of the aristocracy rather than royalty. With the loss of proximity to imperial rulership came the threat of diminished status, and the subsequent medieval centuries were marked by constant attentiveness on the part of the abbesses of St. Servatius to the glorious imperial origins and early history of the convent. When threatened by external forces, both secular and clerical, they often responded with visual assertions of the historical prestige of the house. Many of the artistic commissions by Quedlinburg's abbesses reveal that objective, as do the Abbatial Effigies. Of these, the earliest is a group monument, executed between about 1125 and 1129, that honors Adelheid I, Beatrix I, and Adelheid II, the Ottonian and Salian princesses who reigned over St. Servatius collectively from 999 to 1095. The medieval effigy emerged in the late 11th century and was popularized in the early to mid-12th. In Germany, its origins were thus contemporary with societal upheaval occasioned by the investiture controversy, Saxon revolt against Salian imperial authority, and church reform. Only one effigial memorial definitively predates the first abbatial effigies from Quedlinburg. This is the tomb monument of Rudolf of Swabia of 1080 to 84 in the Cathedral of Merseburg. In 1077, Rudolf was elected anti-king by Saxon nobles antagonistic to the Salian Emperor Henry IV, but he died from wounds incurred during an engagement with Henry's forces in 1080. With iconography that emphasizes rulership, this early medieval effigy celebrates an individual who opposed prevailing imperial authority. Thus, the Saxon challenge to the Salian dynasty is the context for the emergence of the effigial format in medieval Germany. The Quedlinburg triplet is the earliest entirely intact instance in which an effigial memorial commemorates multiple individuals. One other, now incomplete example of a group monument, likewise dating to the 1120s, celebrates the Nellenburg family in the monastery church of Allerheiligen at Schaffhausen in northern Switzerland. Here, Count Eberhard III of Nellenburg, founder in 1049 of the monastery of Allerheiligen, was commemorated together with his wife Ita, their son Burkhard, and two additional family members whose effigies, if they ever existed, are completely lost. Eberhard and Burkhard's effigies in the center and on the left of the left-hand slide survive in good condition, but Ita's effigy on Eberhard's right, only part of the head is original. While the Nellenburg memorial is approximately contemporary with the group monument honoring the 11th century abbesses of Quedlinburg, the figure and drapery style differs, unsurprisingly, in light of the hundreds of miles separating the sites and the lack of any connection between them. In spite of this disparity, Ita's head has been augmented in the contemporary display of the monument in the Museum Allerheiligen with a replica, seen in the middle slide, of the figure of Beatrix from Quedlinburg. In this 21st century reimagination of a 12th century monument, then, the Quedlinburg and Nellenburg figures are closely associated with one another, but in fact, they are differentiated not only by their disparate styles and states of preservation. The Nellenburg monument honors several individuals within a family, whereas the Quedlinburg memorial functions as the visual construction of an abbatial group identity destined to persevere at St. Servatius for centuries. Adelheid I, Beatrix I, and Adelheid II are commemorated with 3 effigies in stucco, a popular medium in medieval northern Germany, that were clearly executed as a single commission. Their height is consistent, but the monument to Adelheid I, direct descendant of the convent's founder, and thus the most prestigious of the 3 women, is appreciably wider than the others. The sloping sides of the frame around her effigy suggest that it was raised above her successors in the memorial's original configuration within the church, enhancing legibility of the inscription on the frame. The arrangement of the 3 effigies is likely to have correlated with the abbess's burials in the eastern nave of St. Servatius. However, 20th century excavations documented with this plan have identified only Adelheid I's gravesite and number 24 here with complete certainty. Upon her death in 1044, Adelheid was buried in a lead coffin in front of the cross altar in the Ottonian church, as befitted a royal abbess. The coffin's stone lid, probably reused from the original sarcophagus of Henry I, supplies her name and date of death and identifies her as abbess and daughter of Otto II. The 2 early medieval graves that flank Adelheid's are very likely the resting places of the Salian princesses who succeeded her. The tomb to the north, at number 23, holds an unmarked lead coffin, while on the south, at number 25, the burial spot is empty. Because there is evidence that the remains of Beatrix I were translated to the monastery at Michaelstein in the 13th century, it is likely that the empty space beside the tomb of Adelheid I belonged to Beatrix, with the resulting inference that the unidentified lead coffin on Adelheid's other side is that of Adelheid II. Although the Ottonian Church of St. Servatius was rebuilt in the Romanesque style during the first 2 decades of the 12th century, the location of these important burials was not lost. The 3 effigies were apparently then erected together, above, or at least very near to, the tombs of the women they commemorated, in the eastern portion of the new Romanesque nave. It is highly probable that the monument, with its important historical associations, was in place upon the consecration of new Basilica of St. Servatius in 1129. Each effigy consists of a female figure standing frontally and rigidly within a sunken basin that is surrounded by a broad outer band of vegetal decoration and a narrower inner band with inscription. The lack of formal distinction among the 3 sculptures emphasizes their group rather than individual identity, and this is further underscored by their clothing, in each case the choir habit of an aristocratic canoness, embellished on the hem of the sleeves and on the shoes. The women's tubular-limbed bodies lack any reference to actual anatomy, and the drapery, with its abstract linear design, disallows any suggestion of underlying volume, except for the figure's slightly protruding stomachs. Few contemporary formal comparenda for the Quedlinburg sculptures exist. However, the approach to the bodies and drapery recalls the apostle sculptures of about 1130 from the convent at Klus near Gandersheim in Lower Saxony. Viewed in conjunction with the building and consecration history of the Romanesque Church of St. Servatius, a comparison with the sculptures at Klus suggests a probable date in the second half of the 1120s for the Quedlinburg effigies. Iconographically, the figures are minimally distinguished from one another. The depiction of three standing frontal women, each prominently holding a book intended to represent a gospel book or perhaps a psalter, traditional symbols of a religious woman's erudition and devotion, is unsurprising. Similar representations of abbesses, canonesses, and nuns survive in various media from the 10th century forward. The precisely contemporary representation of Abbess Walburga of Heidenheim in the Stuttgart Passional is an apposite example. Abbesses are often depicted with their right arm raised in blessing, although the gesture is seen at Quedlinburg only in the effigy of Adelheid I, presumably to underscore her particular importance as a member of the founding Ottonian dynasty. Finally, an inscription runs along the frame of each effigy. In each case, it specifies the name, abbatial role, and date of death of the deceased, though not her imperial identity, and includes a psalm verse that emphasizes the fragility of mortal life and urges humility. These inscriptions differ significantly in their content from the text found on Adelheid I's coffin lid, represented on the right with the inscription enhanced for legibility in the upper slide. The latter explicitly identifies her as the daughter of Emperor Otto II, yet the prominent memorial that rose above her resting place neglects to mention her royal status. The concept of the Quedlinburg abbatiate, revealed by the triple monument, is therefore aristocratic rather than royal, and emphasizes the abbatial role and the devotion and learning of the religious woman, as opposed to individual historical personalities at the apogee of the societal hierarchy. The patron of the triple monument is unknown. The most plausible candidate is the royal woman's younger relative, Agnes I, who would have appreciated the potential of a funerary monument honoring her predecessors to anchor in its imperial historical context the new church, whose construction she oversaw for a period of some 15 years. The question then arises as to whether the memorial was originally intended to include effigies. The anti-imperial, partisan Saxon origins of the effigial format might well have given Agnes pause. In addition, the formal evidence suggests that the effigies do not predate Agnes' death in 1125 or 1126, which furthermore coincided with that of the last Salian emperor, Henry V. The link between the Salian dynasty and St. Servatius was severed upon their deaths. Agnes' successor, Gerburg of Cappenberg, who would in this scenario have inherited the commemorative project, was a Saxon noblewoman, unlikely to have embraced the visual celebration of the imperial status of her abbatial predecessors. Yet as her convent was threatened with loss of relevance concomitant with the end of the Salian dynasty, Gerburg would have appreciated the potential of a memorial honoring these very same women to communicate the glorious origins and history of St. Servatius. The new abbess thus adopted the modern effigy format that had emerged among the Saxon aristocracy to which she belonged, and used the opportunity presented by this commission to put her own ideological stamp on its iconography. Gerburg had a reputation for being extremely devout, embracing Benedictine practices, and preferring a nun's habit to traditional canonical garb, and there is reason to believe that she supported Premonstratensian reform. The effigies resemble a seal portrait that Gerborg herself used. The pictorial concept disclosed by the triple monument to Adelheid I, Beatrix I, and Adelheid II is thus the seminal visualization of the Quedlinburg Abbatiate according to the principles and priorities embraced by Abbess Gerborg in the late 1120s. As it was executed, it represents a nuanced visual assertion of conventual history and status, representing 3 imperial princesses and in this way evoking the convent's originary prestige, yet visualizing them as generic aristocratic religious women, while epigraphically asserting their humility and emphasizing their mortality. Later abbesses would turn to the effigial format as a means of recalling the ideals exhibited in the 12th century memorial. Most of those who did so experienced reigns marked by external threat to the convent, dissension within the community, or both. The effigies of Abbesses Agnes II of Meissen, Sophia of Brena, and Hedwig of Saxony are 3 examples of this phenomenon. From a formal and iconographical perspective, the effigies of Agnes II, and I argue her niece and successor Sophia of Brena, appear to date to the 2nd or 3rd decade of the 13th century. Agnes' memorial is broken on the bottom of the frame, but the extant inscription names her as abbess, supplies her date of death, and expresses the hope that she will rest in eternal peace. The essential iconography, comprising the frontal book-bearing figure standing in a sunken basin, is identical to the 12th century model. However, what were doubtless understood to be appropriate modernisms were introduced into this revered template. Agnes' clothing correlates with early 13th century norms, and her figure is slightly more volumetric than those of her predecessors, likewise in keeping with evolution in figural sculpture over a century or so. The addition of the cushion behind the deceased's head is noteworthy. This motif was introduced only around 1200. These 2 effigies may be the earliest examples of its use for women. The cushion is crucial for an analysis of the effigy that I assign to Sophia of Brena, because it firmly situates the memorial after 1200, disallowing the suggestion put forward by some scholars that it is contemporary with the triple monument of 1125 to 29 and depicts Agnes I or Gerborg of Keppenberg. Sophia's sculpture is severely deteriorated, hindering formal analysis, and any original inscription has been lost. However, a monastically garbed female figure standing in a basin with an object, surely a book, pressed to her chest is nonetheless distinguishable. The vegetal design on the frame is so similar to that on the monument to the Ottonian and Salian abbesses that it has also been suggested that this effigy is an intentionally archaizing work honoring Abbess Gerborg. However, commemorative plaques in general were typically treated with deference over the course of centuries, and the striking state of deterioration in this case, contrasting with the memorials of the 11th century abbesses and Agnes II, argues against an assignment to the esteemed Gerborg. Sophia, on the other hand, was a controversial figure at Quedlinburg, whose tomb monument may have been subjected to neglect or even deliberate mistreatment in the aftermath of her death. The combined reigns of Agnes and Sophia, ranging from 1184 to 1226, coincided with the succession crisis that followed the death of Emperor Henry VI in 1197, when his brother Philip of Swabia contested with the Welf Duke Otto IV. Agnes II of Quedlinburg was a supporter of Philip of Swabia, attending his court in his wife's entourage in 1198. Sophia too initially supported Philip, but switched her allegiance to Otto in 1208 through the disenchantment of former conventual reeve Hoyer von Falkenstein, a supporter of Frederick. Throughout this period, Quedlinburg was a site of armed conflict that resulted in damage to the conventual buildings. Falkenstein's victory in 1223 contributed to Sophia's brief ouster in 1223-24 from the Quedlinburg Abbatiate, and her temporary replacement with Bertradis of Krosigk, sister of the Bishop of Halberstadt. The end of the 12th and the early decades of the 13th century were thus chaotic at St. Servatius. Scholars are nearly unanimous in understanding some of Agnes' art commissions as responses to that turmoil. Under duress, she sought to visualize the historic status of her convent with these projects. One such commission entailed the refurbishment and augmented embellishment of the reliquary of St. Servatius, seen in the left-hand slides. Agnes' kneeling portrait is visible on the silver niello plaque she commissioned for the bottom of the casket. Another is a magnificent knotted carpet embroidered with imagery that reveals the erudition of the religious women who executed it under Agnes' direction. Of this carpet, fragments remain, as you see in the diagram on the right. With these commissions, Agnes recalled the imperial circumstances of the founding of her convent and the autonomy and prestige that followed therefrom. Similar patronal activity on Sophia's part cannot be conclusively demonstrated. However, I find it probable that Sophia commissioned her own and Agnes's effigy. In addition to her external political challenges, Sophia's relationship with the members of her convent was actively antagonistic. An exacerbating factor in this regard was Sophia's feud with Bertradis' brother, the Bishop of Halberstadt, whom she prevented from performing his customary Palm Sunday visit to St. Servatius in the guise of Christ, on the grounds that the community could not withstand the expense of hosting the large retinue that accompanied him. Animosity towards Sophia among members of her convent continued after her death, when Bertradis was again elected abbess. At least one instance when Bertradis falsely maligned her predecessor was recorded. This hostility resulted in Sophia's unpleasant historical reputation, on which the 18th century chronicler Gottfried Voigt lavished considerable attention, including, predictably, the undocumented accusation of, quote, entirely too familiar interaction with 3 different men. This history suggests that the contemporary community was unlikely to memorialize Sophia with an effigial monument after her death. While formal analysis of the monument that I assigned to Sophia is difficult at best, its iconography is essentially identical to that of the 12th century memorial and of Agnes II's monument. In contrast, 2 mid and late 13th century effigies at Quedlinburg, seen here on either side of Sophia's memorial, introduce greater iconographical complexity. I therefore place this effigy in the 2nd or 3rd decade of the 13th century and contend that it was Sophia's own commission. Furthermore, the inclusion of the cushion on Agnes' memorial also suggests Sophia's patronage, or at least oversight, as the motif had only just entered the visual lexicon when Agnes died in 1203, but became standard during Sophia's reign. The patronage of the 2 memorials notwithstanding, however, both effigies allude to the triple monument of 1125-29. Since these 2 abbesses, endured abbatial tenures that were threatened by the larger political circumstances in contemporary Germany, and in Sophia's case at least, by hostilities with the local episcopate and dissension within the conventual community, the latter's sponsorship of memorials that visually recalled the abbatiate of St. Servatius during the glorious era of Ottonian and Salian rule constituted a powerful institutional affirmation. Quedlinburg in the late 15th century would have been nearly unrecognizable to the earlier medieval abbesses, for the town that evolved around the convent had increasingly sought independence from abbatial oversight. This led to significant squabbles during the reign of Anna of Plauen. Her successor, Hedwig, daughter of the Saxon elector Friedrich II of the Wettin dynasty, was elected abbess of St. Servatius at the age of 12, her choice an acknowledgement of the need at St. Servatius for a leader with political clout. Hedwig ruled Quedlinburg, initially under her father's oversight, from 1458 until her death in 1511. She was memorialized with an effigy, aspects of whose personal specificity suggest that it was her own commission. During Hedwig's lengthy tenure, Quedlinburg was coveted by both the Wettins and their territorial rivals, the Hohenzollerns of Brandenburg. The bishop of neighboring Halberstadt, at the time the town reeve, was meddlesome, and the townsfolk mounted challenges to abbatial authority as well. While the Wettin faction ultimately prevailed in Quedlinburg, Hedwig's decades at the helm of St. Servatius were fraught, and predictably she followed several of her predecessors' examples in commissioning an effigy that pictorialized the community's historical identity. In fundamental ways, Hedwig's effigy is consonant with the abbatial model established 400 years before. The abbess stands frontally within a basin, surrounded by an inscribed frame in which she is named, her date of death is supplied, and the wish is expressed that she might rest in peace. The rosary she holds between hands clasped in an attitude of prayer acknowledges her devout nature, just as did the books held by her predecessors on their memorials. And in contrast with contemporary effigies executed for Hedwig's relatives, her own is extremely conservative. To appreciate the old-fashioned nature of Hedwig's monument, one need only observe the brass effigies of Amalia, Hedwig's sister, who died in 1502, and Zdena, her sister-in-law, deceased in 1510. Located in the cathedral at Meissen, both memorials explore spatiality and figural naturalism in keeping with their early 16th century date. The commonalities that link the brasses suggest that they were conceived as a pair, representing into eternity the women of the Wettin dynasty. In each case, the figure wears a mantle with long vertical folds, a soft cap, and a wimple. Amalia and Zdena stand on patterned tile and turn slightly to the left. Heads bowed, they hold rosaries between the fingers of their praying hands. Brocaded tapestries hang behind them. In the upper or lower corners are two shields with coats of arms. Both monuments reveal interest in illusionistic space. A room extends behind Amalia, conveyed by the half columns that flank her lower body and the perspectival treatment of the tiles, though it is then closed off by the tapestry and the intertwined branches and vines in the upper half of the composition. Zdena is not represented in perspectival space. The tiles seem rather to tilt up, but the three-dimensionality of the room behind her head betrays the artist's desire to experiment with an illusionistic environment. A motif shared among these three Wettin effigies are the armorial devices, which were at this point quite common on aristocratic funerary monuments honoring secular and religious individuals. At Quedlinburg, a modest coat of arms already appeared on the tomb slab of Anna of Plauen, Hedwig's predecessor. Hedwig's memorial is rare for a woman, however, in the lavish extent of the heraldry, which identifies the deceased as a member of noble houses of Saxony and Brunswick and the royal dynasties of Poland and Austria. These coats of arms constitute the emphatic assertion of a secular identity within the body of a religious woman. Similarly, Hedwig's effigy is unusual in that the deceased's headdress stands in ostentatious contrast to the modest veils and wimples adopted by her predecessors and her secular female relatives. This type of head covering, popular particularly between about 1480 and 1510, is seen principally in portraits of secular women. It seems that Hedwig's adoption of such overt symbols of her identity as a high-ranking noblewoman, embedded within the context of the type of tomb marker employed for centuries at Quedlinburg, was intended to express the secular lineage of this abbess specifically and the benefits that accrued from it to the convent. As the two monuments of Agnes II, Sophia of Brena, and Hedwig of Saxony demonstrate, abbatial effigies were commissioned by abbesses during whose reigns the convent of St. Servatius was in some way threatened. The continuity of the composition and iconography of these and other abbatial effigies at St. Servatius indicates the extent to which they were conceived specifically for this community. Through the representation of abbatial identity on the site of the abbesses' bodies, this succession of tomb monuments functioned as a reminder of St. Servatius' history, of its conventual identity built on the bedrock principles of royal foundation and beneficence, of its traditionally exalted position in German medieval society, and of the deference due the community from external religious and secular authorities. Yet, while the abbatial effigies of medieval Quedlinburg reflect an institutional culture that flourished for 700 years, these monuments that are so communicative about the convent's history and status supply no evidence for their ritual function. No surviving textual source mentions the effigies. We can look to ritual practices at similar contemporary convents, of course, but the evidence is slim. At Essen, for instance, the late medieval Ordo specifies that 11 abbatial tombs, including that of Abbess Matilda, Otto I's granddaughter, who reigned from about 973 to 1011, were lit throughout the night prior to the anniversary of death by 4 candles placed on or around the grave. While such a ritual could easily have occurred at Quedlinburg as well, there is no evidence for it. An Easter performance at Gernrode, which is quite close to Quedlinburg, preserved in a processional text of 1502, likewise suggests an intriguing possibility. The convent's first abbess, Hatowi, who died in 1014, was buried in front of the cross altar in the convent church, that is, in an analogous position to Adelheid I of Quedlinburg, and subsequently, presumably, Beatrix I and Adelheid II. At Easter, at Gernrode, 3 canonesses, playing the 3 Marys, visited the Holy Sepulchre, seen in the right aisle in the interior view, and subsequently Hatowi's grave, where the celebrant performing the role of Christ asked them, "Maria, quid ploras?" Immediately thereafter, the women approached the current abbess with the news of the resurrection. It seems, however, that this performance, incorporating the first abbess's tomb and including a role for the current abbess within the Easter liturgy, was unique to Gernrode. Similar practice is not demonstrable at the comparable convents of Gandersheim and Essen, for both of which textual evidence of Easter performance survives. While there is no indication that Easter was observed with liturgical theater at Quedlinburg, it certainly cannot be ruled out, particularly since the Ottonian emperors and some of their successors typically celebrated the feast at St. Servatius. Here, however, the first superior and the first abbess of the convent, Queen Matilda and her granddaughter, Abbess Matilda, were interred in the crypt. Even if the unusual incorporation of foundational abbatial tombs into the Easter liturgy occurred at Quedlinburg in a fashion analogous to Bernrode, the official memorials honoring later abbesses would not have figured in the ritual. Evidence for the integration of the official memorials into liturgical practice at St. Servatius on any occasion is simply non-existent. The commemorative culture at Quedlinburg changed significantly with the introduction of Protestantism, which occurred after the death in 1539 of the Reeve Duke George of Saxony, Abbess Hedwig's nephew and a committed Roman Catholic. The conversion was instigated and brought to fruition by the long-reigning Abbess Anna von Stolberg-Wernigerode, who was abbess from 1515 to 1574. From this point onwards, much of the treasury contents was meaningful only by virtue of the object's historical aspect and aesthetic quality. Already on September 18, 1540, representatives of Duke Henry IV of Saxony, as committed a Lutheran as his recent brother George was a Roman Catholic, ordered the removal from St. Servatius of, quote, unnecessary altars and furnishings, in order to accommodate the congregation in a manner more fitting to the new Lutheran liturgical practices. Of most consequence for the effigies installed in the nave was the introduction there of pews, as well as loges for individuals and families of rank. Because of this new requirement, the abbess corralled a group of medieval memorials into an oblong field of 3 lateral rows, accommodated among the pews in the nave. However, this communal abbatial monument was covered with paving stones in 1676 in order that an additional bank of pews could be introduced into the center of the nave as part of the extensive modifications, largely in the Baroque style, that took place between 1672 and 1677. The result of the campaign is reflected in this print. By the late 17th century, then, the effigies were perceived as inconsequential, even within the context of conventual history, sufficiently meaningless that they could be lost entirely from access and even sight, and eventually, of course, from memory. Ironically, it is precisely during this period, at the end of the 17th century, and particularly throughout the 18th, that the ranks of visitors to Quedlinburg included many learned gentlemen impassioned by history and its artifacts. Some were guided by an enlightened zeal to personally investigate and analyze historical objects, while others were drawn to the romance of the medieval, particularly the German medieval past. The memorials that told such an extensive story of the convent were, however, invisible to and unknown by them. In 1858, Ferdinand von Krast, conservator of historical monuments in Prussia, began a project of restoration at Quedlinburg. Considerable excavation was undertaken at this time, in the course of which, in 1863, the mid-16th century assemblage of effigies in the center of the nave, obscured since the late 17th century, was rediscovered. The extant monuments found there numbered 8, 6 of them inscribed legibly so that they could be easily identified as the memorials of Adelheid I, Beatrix I, Adelheid II, Gertrude of Umfort, Adelheid IV, and Anna of Plauen. 2 additional effigies were respectively uninscribed and so deteriorated as to make an inscription indistinguishable. In the first instance, seen in the slide on the left, the well-preserved memorial can be assigned on stylistic grounds to the 1230s or 40s, and is most likely to commemorate Bertrandus of Krosigk, or one of her two short-lived immediate successors. The second is the plaque I have assigned to Sophia of Brena. Additionally, Kvast found the effigy of Hedwig of Saxony in the place it had apparently always occupied between the choir access stairs, and that of Agnes II in the eastern bay of the south aisle. Kvast directed that Agnes' effigy be moved into the 16th century grid to create a symmetrical field of 9 markers, which he separated with slate tiles and enclosed within a brass grate. Kvast intended for this collective effigial display, seen in this slide, to be an aesthetically pleasing monument to St. Servatius' history, but it was not to be. Like their 17th century predecessors, the contemporary Lutheran congregation was displeased by the attendant disruptions to the furnishings of the nave, and in 1907, the effigial memorials were removed to the crypt. As we have seen, the effigies of the Quedlinburg abbesses served repeatedly to assert the community's foundational prestige and to communicate its unique identity through the consistent representation of the abbatial bodies. These follow a template established for the imperial princesses of a bygone era, honored with the iconographically nuanced monument of 1125 to 29. Even as iconographical details differ slightly and garb and figure style evolve, the essential consistency is striking. More than half a millennium after the last of these monuments was executed, the circumstances, principles, and priorities of the ancient royal house of canonesses at Quedlinburg are clearly visible to the modern viewer through the lens of these effigies. Thank you.